It was an age of glittering ballrooms and ruthless gossip, when a woman's reputation could be broken with a whisper behind a fan. And for Duchess Roblin Harwood, clever, stubborn, and far too unmarried, those whispers were sharpening into knives. Before we step into the Duke of Alistair's ballroom, where a single glance would upend her quiet defiance, go ahead and like this video. If by the end it hasn't earned that click, you may feel entirely free to unlike it. No hard feelings. Now let us begin with Roblin Harwood and the return of Damien Edward Constantine, known to society as the Black Duke, the man most feared in England. The whispers followed her like a draft in a poorly sealed ballroom, a chill that had nothing to do with the night air and everything to do with the title she carried. Duchess. It was a word that should have commanded respect. At 26, however, and still unmarried, it was beginning to sound like an epitaph. The leftover Duchess, Dahlia murmured behind her fan, her voice a sickly sweet poison meant to carry. Her friends, a gaggle of girls barely out of the schoolroom, tittered in agreement. They were this season's prized fillies, all wide eyes and trembling hopes, and Duchess Roblin Harwood was the cautionary tale they were trotted past. See what happens when you are too particular? See what happens when you refuse good offers? You end up like her. Roblin didn't turn. She would never give them the satisfaction. Instead, she took a deliberate sip of her lukewarm champagne and let her gaze drift over the glittering crush of bodies in the Duke of Alistair's ballroom. It was the 5th such event in as many weeks, and the performance was always the same. The hopeful mothers, their eyes sharp as hawks. The preening sons, their bows as practiced as their smiles. And her, a fixed point in their swirling social orbit, an object of pity and speculation. They thought her heart broken. A tragic spinster pining for a love that never was. The truth was far less romantic and far more damning. She was bored. She was tired of conversations that felt like negotiations and glances that felt like assessments. She had refused 2 marquises and a viscount, not because their chins were weak or their estates entailed, but because the thought of spending the rest of her life listening to them breathe felt like a sentence of death by 1,000 shallow sighs. You cannot afford to look so unimpressed with the world, Roblin. Her godmother, Lady Agatha, appeared at her elbow, her own gaze sweeping the room with the tactical precision of a general surveying a battlefield. She was a kind woman, but her kindness was sharpened by a pragmatism Roblin found suffocating. "I'm not unimpressed with the world," Roblin said, her voice low. "Just this small, gilded corner of it. This corner is your world," Lady Agatha countered, her fingers giving her goddaughter's arm a gentle squeeze. "Your father left you a title and a fortune, but he did not leave you a shield. A husband is a shield, my dear. Time, it is not your ally." Roblin knew she was right. Every day she remained unmarried, her position grew more precarious. Her lands were managed by a cousin who looked at her accounts with a little too much hunger in his eyes. Without a husband to solidify her standing, she was an anomaly, a problem to be solved. To them, her intelligence was a liability, her inheritance a prize to be claimed. She was not a woman, she was a title in need of a lord. "Perhaps I don't want a shield," she murmured, more to herself than to her godmother. "Perhaps I want a sword." Lady Agatha sighed, the sound a mixture of frustration and affection. "Leave the swords to the men. Find a decent one to stand in front of you, and you will be safe behind him." Safe. The word felt like a shroud. Roblin looked at the flushed, dancing couples. They were all playing their parts, spinning in time to the music, their faces plastered with perfect smiles. But she could see the cracks, the flicker of desperation in a young lady's eyes as she tried to charm a reluctant earl, the heavy weariness on a husband's shoulders as he nodded to his wife's incessant chatter. It wasn't safety, it was surrender. And she was not ready to surrender. The heat of the room, thick with the scent of wilting roses and expensive perfume, suddenly felt unbearable. The violin seemed to scrape against her nerves. She could feel Dahlia's gaze on her back, could almost hear the next venomous whisper forming on her lips. That was it. She was done. She placed her untouched glass on a passing servant's tray. "Godmother," she said, her tone polite but final. "The hour grows late. I believe I will take my leave." Her godmother's eyes widened in alarm. So early. "Roblin, you haven't even danced. What will people say?" "That the leftover Duchess has finally accepted her fate." The thought was bitter. "Let them say what they will," Roblin replied, turning to face her. She offered her a small, genuine smile, a rare thing in a place like this. "They are going to anyway. Good night, Agatha." She didn't wait for a protest. She moved through the throng with a practiced grace, her head held high. She could feel the stares, the sudden lulls in conversation as she passed. Her departure was an event, a ripple in their placid sea of decorum. For a woman to leave a ball alone before midnight was not a tragedy. It was a statement, an admission of defeat. They didn't understand. This wasn't defeat, it was escape. The cool night air was a balm as she stepped onto the portico. The press of the crowd faded behind her, replaced by the gentle clatter of harnesses and the low murmur of coachmen. She took a deep, cleansing breath, the first she'd taken all evening. "The Duchess of Harwood's carriage," she told the footman, who bowed low. As she waited, a shadow fell across the grand, torch-lit entrance. It wasn't her carriage that had pulled up to the stone steps. It was another, one she had never seen before. It was impossibly black, carved from dark wood, so polished it seemed to drink the light around it. There was no crest on the door, no ostentatious display of wealth. It needed none. The carriage itself was a declaration of power, stark, severe, and absolute. It was pulled by 2 horses the color of midnight, their breath pluming in the chill. A footman in a plain black livery disembarked. He moved with a soldier's economy, his face a mask of indifference. He didn't announce his master. He didn't have to. The carriage stood there in the night, a silent, ominous promise. A disruption. Most of the guests, still inside, lost in their waltzes and wine, did not notice. They didn't see the world outside their glittering ballroom tilt on its axis. But she did. She saw the darkness arrive, and she felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. A premonition that the quiet, predictable life she was so desperate to escape was about to be broken by a storm. For 10 years, Duke Damien Constantine had been a ghost, a whispered legend haunting the drawing rooms of London. They called him the Black Duke, a name earned in the blood and shadows of war, a name that clung to him now like the damp chill of the English night. He had returned under a shroud of mystery, his reasons his own, and as he stood in the alcove of the Duke of Alister's ballroom, he found society just as he'd left it, a glittering, suffocating cage of performance. His gaze swept the room, dissecting it with the cold precision of a battlefield strategist. He saw the alliances and the rivalries, the desperate mothers parading their polished daughters, the vapid young men whose greatest campaigns were fought at the card table. It was a contemptible theatre, and he had no interest in the play. His mother, the Dowager Duchess, had insisted he attend. "You must be seen," she'd commanded. "You must remind them that the House of Constantine endures." So he stood and he watched, a predator in a room of peacocks, his presence a dark, unnerving thread in their vibrant tapestry. Then his eyes stopped. Across the room, standing apart from the swirling dancers, was a woman. She was not the most flamboyant, nor the most classically beautiful. But she was the most still, while every other soul in the room was engaged in the frantic art of being noticed. She seemed perfectly content to simply exist. There was a quiet defiance in the set of her shoulders, an intelligence in her observant eyes that mirrored his own. He watched as a gaggle of younger women passed her, their whispers like the flick of a whip. He saw her spine stiffen, a subtle reaction, but he saw it. He saw her speak with an older woman, her expression polite but strained. And then he saw her leave. She didn't flee in a fit of pique. She departed with a calm finality that was more powerful than any tantrum. She was escaping. The realization struck him with an unexpected jolt of recognition. He didn't know her name. He only knew that in a room full of puppets, she was the only one who had cut her own strings. An hour later, the oppressive warmth of the ball had been replaced by the cold marble of Constantine House. The air was heavy with the scent of beeswax and unspoken expectations. His mother, Ruth, the Dowager Duchess, was waiting for him in the study, a formidable figure seated by a low-burning fire. "You were barely there," she began, her voice devoid of preamble. "You stood in the shadows like a common footpad." "I was present." "That is what you asked," Damien replied, pouring himself a brandy. The amber liquid was a stark contrast to the cloying champagne of the ball. "Presence is not enough. The dukedom needs an heir, Damien. You are 33. Your father was married with 2 sons by your age. This family line, this legacy, it rests entirely on you." Her words were stones, each one chosen to build a wall of duty around him. "The dukedom has me," he said, his voice flat. "The dukedom has a ghost," she retorted, rising to her feet. "A man who spent a decade at war and returned with nothing but a fearsome reputation and a closed heart. You need a wife. A duchess to stand by your side, to manage this house, to give you a son." The muscle in his jaw clenched. The word love was never mentioned. It was a transaction, a duty. He thought of the woman at the ball, the one who looked as though she'd choke on the very duties his mother was describing. "I am not interested in the simpering debutantes of the ton," he said coolly. "Then find one who does not simper. But find one you must." The study doors opened, and Damien's younger brother Bram sauntered in, a cheerful grin on his face that was entirely out of place with the room's oppressive tension. "Good Lord, are we on about the great Constantine succession again? Mother, you'll scare him back to the continent." "This is not a joking matter, Bram," the dowager snapped. "Isn't it?" Bram said, moving to stand beside Damien. "My brother, the great and terrible Black Duke, terrified of a little matchmaking." He nudged Damien's shoulder. "What is it you fear? That you'll have to make polite conversation? Or that you might actually find someone you like?" Damien turned his cold gaze on his brother. He was tired of the pressure, the prodding, the endless talk of duty. He was a man who solved problems with swift, decisive action. This was just another problem, another campaign to be won. "It is not fear," Damien said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous level. "It is a matter of efficiency." He downed the rest of his brandy in one swallow, the fire of it doing little to warm the ice in his veins. He set the glass down with a definitive click. His mother and brother watched him, waiting. "You want a bride?" he said, his eyes locking onto his mother's. "You want an heir to secure this family? Fine." He turned his gaze to Bram, a predatory light glinting in his eyes. He saw the challenge, the game, and he would win it on his own terms. "I'll make you a bet, brother," Damien declared, the words cutting through the silence of the room. "I will choose a bride in 1 week." A week was a laughably short time to select a duchess, and Damien Constantine intended to waste none of it. He moved through the cream and gold ballroom of Viscountess Aubrey's estate with a singular purpose. The air was bright, almost unnaturally so, the light from the chandeliers glittering off polished marble and shimmering silks. He ignored the fawning mothers and their daughters, whose pastel gowns seemed to blur into a single, desperate tapestry. His eyes scanned the room for the one woman who wasn't playing the game. He found her near the French doors leading to the gardens, a solitary figure in a gown of deep, arresting emerald. Duchess Roblin Harwood. He had learned her name the morning after his wager with Bram. The leftover Duchess, they called her. Society saw her as a failure. Damien saw a puzzle. She was watching the dancers with an analytical stillness, her expression composed. She did not look lonely. She looked observant, as if she were a general studying an opposing army. The thought amused him. His amusement curdled into something colder as he watched Dahlia, the newly married Marchioness of Fenwick, approach Roblin with two of her chattering friends in tow. Dahlia, whose ambition was matched only by her cruelty, held a glass of red wine with a careless affectation. "Duchess," Dahlia said, her voice carrying across the music. "All alone again, I see. One would think you would have learned your lesson by now." Roblin's posture did not change. "I'm not certain there is a lesson to be learned from enjoying a moment of peace, Lady Fenwick." Dahlia's smile was thin and sharp. "The lesson is that a woman of your status cannot afford to look so aloof. It is unbecoming." With a flick of her wrist, she stumbled, sloshing the dark red wine down the front of Roblin's emerald silk gown. The stain bloomed like a dark, ugly wound. A collective gasp rippled through those nearby. Humiliation was a spectator sport in the ton, and this was a masterful stroke. "Oh, my heavens! How clumsy of me!" Dahlia cried with theatrical dismay. "Your gown is utterly ruined." Damien watched, his entire body going still. He expected tears, a furious retort, a panicked flight from the room. That is what any other woman would do. Roblin did none of those things. She simply looked down at the spreading stain, then back up at Dahlia, and her voice was unnervingly calm. "It is just a dress, my lady. It can be cleaned, unlike some reputations." The composure was magnificent. It was a clean, precise strike, delivered not with a shout, but with a whisper-sharp blade. Dahlia's face flushed with fury, her victory soured. She was left stammering as Roblin simply took a handkerchief from her reticule and began to delicately blot the stain, her movements measured and graceful. She refused to be rattled. She refused to give them the drama they craved. And in that moment, Damien Constantine knew his search was over. He began to move. The crowd parted for him as if by instinct, whispers following in his wake. The Black Duke was on the move. He stopped directly in front of the two women, his shadow falling over them. Dahlia paled, curtsying so low she nearly stumbled again. Damien's piercing blue eyes did not even grant her a glance. They were fixed solely on Roblin. She looked up, her hand pausing its work. He saw surprise flicker in her eyes, but no fear. "Not a trace. Your Grace," she said, her voice even. He ignored the ruined gown, the gawking onlookers, the stifling tension in the air. He saw only the intelligent, defiant woman who had just faced down a wolf with nothing but her own dignity. He gave a slight, formal bow. "Duchess Harwood," he said, his voice a low command that cut through all other sound. "They are playing a waltz. I believe you owe me a dance." It was not a question. It was a declaration. The world seemed to hold its breath. The musicians faltered for a half-beat. Every fan in the room froze. The Duke of Constantine, the man who never danced, the man who hadn't been seen in society for a decade, was not just dancing, but asking the one woman everyone else had dismissed. Roblin's eyes searched his, looking for the trick, the mockery. She found none, only a strange, unnerving seriousness. A long, silent moment passed between them, a battle of wills played out in a glance. Then she gave a slow, deliberate nod. "I don't recall incurring the debt, Your Grace," she said softly, placing her hand in his outstretched one. "But I will allow you to pay it." As he led her to the center of the floor, a sound rippled through the stunned ballroom. It began as a murmur, then grew into a wave of shocked, incredulous applause. They had come for a spectacle of humiliation, and the Black Duke had just given them a coronation. The final, soaring notes of the waltz faded into the vast, brightly lit ballroom, but the silence that followed was louder than any music. The applause, when it came, was a thunderclap of shock and approval, a collective roar from a crowd that had witnessed the impossible. For 3 surreal minutes, Duchess Roblin Harwood had been held in the arms of the Black Duke, the center of a world that had, until now, only ever pushed her to its margins. The brilliant, diamond-like light of the chandeliers felt less like a celebration and more like an interrogation lamp, pinning her in place. Every eye in the room was on her, their expressions a mixture of envy, disbelief, and hungry speculation. The dance had been a statement, but Roblin knew it was not her statement to make. It was his, and she had no idea what it meant. As Damien released her, his hand lingering for a half-second longer than necessary, her first instinct was to flee. This brief, bewildering elevation of her status was a fluke, a whim of a powerful man. The moment she was out of his arms, she would be the leftover Duchess once more, now with the added humiliation of having been his momentary plaything. She executed a flawless curtsy, her movements economical and precise. It was a gesture of finality, of polite dismissal. "Your Grace," she murmured, her eyes cast downward as she rose, already turning to retreat into the vibrant sea of onlookers. "Duchess." His voice was not loud, but it cut through the din of the ballroom and stopped her cold. It was a quiet command, a silken chain that halted her escape. She turned back to him slowly. The crowd, sensing a second act to the drama, pressed in, their whispers a low, expectant hiss. Damien's handsome face was a stark, unreadable mask in the bright, unforgiving light. His piercing blue eyes were fixed on her, shutting out the rest of the world. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He spoke as if they were the only two people in the room, his words simple, direct, and utterly insane. "Would you consider marrying me, Duchess?" The question landed with no weight at all, for it was surely a phantom. A trick of the ear. Roblin was certain she had misheard him. The stress of the evening, of Dahlia's cruelty, and this bizarre dance, must have finally fractured her composure. She stared at him, waiting for him to clarify, to say something that made sense. He said nothing. He simply watched her, his expression unwavering. Her mind began to race, tumbling through possibilities, each one more horrifying than the last. This was a jest. It had to be. A new, exquisitely cruel game designed by the most feared man in England. Was Bram nearby, waiting to collect on some perverse wager? Was the entire ballroom in on the joke, waiting for her to blush and stammer like a fool so they could all laugh? She scanned his face for the tell, for the flicker of mockery in those crystalline eyes, the slightest upturn of his lips. There was nothing. Only a grave, unnerving stillness, an intensity that was starting to feel terrifyingly real. The arrogance of it sent a hot flash of anger through her. To humiliate her so publicly, to use her as a prop in his grand, mysterious return to society. Her fear was rapidly being consumed by a cold, protective rage. She lifted her chin, her voice dripping with ice. "A jest, Your Grace? I must confess, after the incident with the wine, I find I have lost my taste for public spectacle." He did not react to her barb. His gaze never wavered. "It is not a jest," he stated, his tone flat, devoid of any emotion at all. "It is a proposal." The words so plainly spoken finally crashed through her defenses. He was serious. The Black Duke, a man who could have any woman in England, a man of immense power and wealth, was standing in the middle of a ballroom asking her, the leftover, the forgotten, the unwanted, for her hand in marriage. The sheer, unadulterated absurdity of it was an insult more profound than any spilled wine. He did not know her. He did not desire her. This was a transaction, a move in a game she didn't understand, and she was the pawn. A bitter laugh almost escaped her lips. She thought of a lifetime shackled to this cold, calculating man, of being a duchess in a cage made of duty and his dark, unknowable whims. The prospect was suffocating. She looked directly into his eyes, letting him see the full force of her unbroken will. "I'd sooner marry a storm, Your Grace," she said, her voice low, but clear as a bell. "At least it's honest with its violence." Roblin had fled London at dawn. Her country estate, Harwood Manor, was a sanctuary of sprawling green lawns and airy rooms filled with the clean, bright light of the morning sun. It was a world away from the suffocating grandeur of the Ton. She had put the entire, bizarre affair with the Duke of Constantine behind her. Her refusal had been absolute. A man like that, a man whose pride was as legendary as his reputation, would not pursue the matter further. It was over. She was in the morning room, sunlight streaming through the tall windows as she reviewed the estate's ledgers, when she heard it. The crunch of carriage wheels on the gravel drive. A moment later, her butler, a man whose composure had been perfected over 3 decades of service, entered the room with an expression of faint alarm. "Your Grace," he announced, his voice tight. "You have a visitor. The Duke of Constantine." Roblin's pen froze over a column of figures. It was impossible. He couldn't be here. She rose slowly and walked to the window, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. There, like a black scar on the pristine landscape, was his crestless carriage. Damien himself was ascending the steps to her front door, his dark coat a stark contrast to the bright, cheerful morning. Her shock quickly hardened into resolve. He had cornered her in a ballroom. She would not be cornered in her own home. She met him in the grand foyer, the bright sunlight from the open doors backlighting her, turning her into a silhouette. "Your Grace," she said, her tone leaving no doubt that he was unwelcome. "I believe I made my position quite clear last night." "You compared me to a storm," Damien stated, his voice calm. He stepped into the foyer, and the space suddenly seemed smaller. It was a memorable rejection, but it was not a final one. It was the only one you shall receive. "I made a wager with my brother," he said, and the blunt honesty of it took her breath away, "that I would choose a bride in 1 week. Yesterday was day 1. Roblin stared at him. A wager, her public humiliation, and his grand, shocking proposal were all because of a childish bet. The anger that had protected her last night returned, cold and sharp. But with it came an idea. A spark of defiance. He had set the timeline. She would set the terms. "You have 6 days left then," she said, her mind working with startling clarity. She was no longer a pawn in his game. She was a competing player. "Very well, Your Grace. You wish to win your wager? Then you will do so on my field, by my rules." A flicker of genuine surprise crossed his handsome features. This was not the reaction he had expected. "I will give you your week," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "You may visit me here, at Harwood. You may walk with me, you may talk with me, and for the next 6 days, you will attempt to convince me that a marriage between us would be anything other than a catastrophe. If at the end of that week you have succeeded, I will consider your proposal. If you fail, you will depart, and never speak of this or your wager again. Do you accept?" It was a challenge, a gauntlet thrown down on the sun-drenched marble of her home. Damien's surprise slowly melted into a look of profound amusement. A slow, dangerous smile touched his lips for the very first time. He thought this was a game. He believed he had already won. "I accept your terms, Duchess," he said. The days that followed were a strange and unsettling treaty. The feared Black Duke became a fixture at her quiet country home. On the first day, they walked the vibrant, manicured gardens. He did not ply her with compliments. He argued with her about Napoleon's tactics at Waterloo. He was brilliant, his strategic mind a thing of sharp, analytical beauty. She found herself parrying his points with her own, the thrill of a true intellectual contest, something she hadn't realized she'd been starved for. On the 3rd day, a steady rain kept them indoors. She found him in her library, her sanctuary. He was not looking at the titles, but at the light streaming through the tall, arched windows, his expression uncharacteristically distant. He turned and saw her, and instead of speaking, he simply gestured to a worn volume of poetry on her desk. He began to recite a verse from it, his voice a low, resonant murmur that filled the quiet room. It was a poem about exile and loss and a longing for a home that no longer exists. They spent the rest of the afternoon sharing books, reading passages aloud, the air crackling with an intimacy that felt far more dangerous than any ballroom waltz. He spoke of history not as a collection of dates, but as a series of human emotions: greed, love, betrayal, and sorrow. That evening, as Roblin sat alone watching the last rays of sun paint the sky, a profound and terrifying realization began to settle over her. She had invited him here to expose him as the monster society claimed he was. She had expected a ruthless tyrant, a cold-hearted strategist playing a game. But the man in her library, the man who argued with such passion and spoke of poetry with such sorrow, he was not a storm. He was not what society said at all. And that, she thought with a sudden, sharp intake of breath, was infinitely more dangerous. It was the 5th day. A fragile truce had settled over Harwood Manor, the passing hours marked by the scent of old books and the sound of intelligent debate. The game, it seemed, had been replaced by something quieter, something far more unnerving. Roblin found Damien in the conservatory late that afternoon. A storm was brewing on the horizon, the sky a bruised purple, but the room itself was filled with a soft golden light that filtered through the glass panes. He was standing perfectly still, his back to her, staring out at the turbulent clouds. For the first time, he did not look like the feared Black Duke or a man executing a plan. He just looked lost. The guardedness that he wore like armor had slipped, and in its place was a profound weariness. Roblin felt the question leave her lips before she had a chance to censor it. "What happened to you, Damien?" She had never used his given name before. It hung in the quiet, humid air between them. He turned slowly, his blue eyes clouded with memories. He looked at her for a long moment, a silent battle waging within him. Then the walls came down. "I was a different man before the war," he began, his voice rough. "Younger. I believed in things. Honor, glory, love." He looked past her, his gaze unfocused. "On the battlefield, you learn glory is just what they call it when you're the one who lives. I watched my best friend, a boy I'd known since we were children, die in the mud over a patch of land no one remembers the name of." The confession was stark, stripped of all poetry. Roblin could almost feel the coldness of that memory, the ghost of it in the warm, flower-scented air. "I was stationed in Portugal for 2 years, he continued, his voice dropping lower. "The letters from home were my only lifeline. There was a woman, Lady Annalise. We were to be married when I returned. I loved her. Or I believed I did." A bitter, mirthless smile touched his lips. "When a cannonball nearly took my leg, the reports of my injuries were exaggerated. For 6 months, London believed I was dead. By the time my letters correcting the error arrived, she had already married a baron with half my land, but twice my proximity." He finally met Roblin's gaze, and the raw pain in his eyes was a physical blow. "She didn't betray me for love. She betrayed me for convenience. That is what London society taught me love is. A transaction, a title, a convenience." He fell silent. The air was thick with his hurt, with a decade of bitterness and disillusionment. Roblin felt an ache of recognition so sharp it stole her breath. His pain, though born of war and betrayal, mirrored her own lonely battle. "When my parents died," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "my title became my identity. My godmother, Agatha, did her best. But everyone, every tutor, every suitor, every gossiping mother reminded me of my worth. They praised my mind as a charming oddity, but they measured my value in acres and pounds. I was not a woman. I was a dowry, a prize to be won by the most persistent man." She looked at him, the man society called a monster, and saw a reflection of her own gilded cage. They were two sides of the same coin. He, who had lost his faith in love, and she who had never been given the chance to find it. The space between them was no longer a battlefield of wit and terms. It was a quiet, shared sanctuary of understanding. The last of the afternoon sun broke through the clouds, casting a single, golden shaft of light that enveloped them. He took a step closer, his movement slow, deliberate. "I saw you at that ball," he murmured, his voice now a low thrum that vibrated through her. "And you were the only person in the room who wasn't trying to sell something." He lifted his hand, his fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was not possessive, but hesitant, reverent. It sent a tremor through her entire body. He was so close now she could see the flecks of gold in his blue eyes, could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. The scent of rain and earth clung to him. His gaze dropped to her lips. The world, the wager, the storm outside, it all faded away to nothing. There was only the charged silence, the space of a single breath between them. He leaned in, his eyes fluttering shut. And then, just as his lips were about to touch hers, he stopped. His eyes snapped open, a fresh wave of conflict washing over them. The vulnerability was gone, replaced by the Duke's formidable self-control. He pulled his hand back as if burned, taking a half step away. The spell was shattered. The moment of intimacy evaporated, leaving a raw, aching tension in its place. The kiss that had almost been, the kiss that had felt like a conclusion, a surrender, now hung between them. A question more powerful than any words. It was day 6, the final full day of their strange and binding agreement. Duty had called them back to London for an afternoon music-hall at the home of a prominent earl. The truce of Harwood Manor evaporated in the bright, cloying atmosphere of the city. After the raw intimacy of their shared confessions and the electric shock of their almost kiss, they now circled each other with a new, unspoken tension. They were no longer player and pawn. They were two people acutely, terrifyingly aware of what was at stake. Roblin had sought a moment of quiet on a sun-drenched terrace, the vibrant colours of the garden a stark contrast to the turmoil in her heart. It was there that Lord Redgrave found her. He was a man she had refused 2 seasons ago, a suitor with a weak chin and an ego as fragile as spun glass. Rejection had curdled him into something venomous. "Duchess," he said, his smile failing to reach his cold eyes, "I see you have found a new, more formidable admirer. One must wonder what the Black Duke sees in a woman so determined to remain on the shelf." "If you will excuse me, Lord Redgrave, I am not in the mood for your particular brand of charm today," Roblin said, turning to leave. "I wouldn't," he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing hiss. He stepped closer, blocking her path. "I have recently come into possession of some of your late father's letters. It seems the Harwood finances were not quite as robust as the world believed. In fact, a great deal of debt was forgiven by the Crown in exchange for certain political favours. Favours that border on treason." Ice flooded Roblin's veins. It was a lie, a grotesque twisting of her father's complicated history. But it was a lie that would stick. In the viper's nest of the Torn, a whisper of treason was as good as a conviction. "What is it you want?" she asked, her voice steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. "You will announce your engagement." "To me?" Redgrave said, his eyes glittering with triumph. "You will dismiss your pet duke. You will restore my honour, and in return, these unfortunate letters will never see the light of day. You have until midnight." He was blackmailing her, using the memory of her father to trap her in the very life she had fought so desperately to avoid. She felt the walls closing in, the bright, cheerful sounds of the party turning into a mocking roar. "That will not be necessary." The voice came from the doorway to the terrace. Damien stood there, a figure of absolute stillness against the bright, crowded room behind him. It was impossible to know how long he had been listening, his handsome face an unreadable mask. He walked toward them, his steps measured and silent. His gaze was not on Redgrave. It was on Roblin, and it was surprisingly gentle. "Go inside, Roblin," he said, his voice soft. "Join your godmother. I will handle this." It was a dismissal, but it felt like a rescue. She hesitated for a second, then gave a slight nod and swept past him into the music hall, her heart hammering. Damien waited until she was gone. Then he turned his attention to Lord Redgrave. The temperature on the terrace seemed to drop 10 degrees. He did not raise his voice. He did not issue a challenge. He simply dismantled the man where he stood. "You believe you have leverage," Damien said, his voice a low, lethal whisper. "You have your letters. I have your gambling debts. I have the name of the married woman you meet with every Thursday. I have the testimony of 2 men who say your father bought your commission in the army. If you so much as look at the Duchess again, if the word treason even forms in your insignificant mind, I will not ruin you, Redgrave. I will unmake you. I will erase you so completely your own mother will not remember your name." Redgrave's face had gone the color of ash. He was trembling, all his smug confidence shattered by the quiet, surgical ferocity of a true predator. "Do you understand me?" Damien finished. Redgrave could only nod, a pathetic, jerky movement. He stumbled backward, turned, and fled the terrace like a beaten dog. The court had seen it all. The tense confrontation, Redgrave's pale-faced terror, the Duke's cold, possessive stance over the Duchess. They hadn't heard the words, but they drew their own, breathless conclusion. This was not a game. This was not a wager. This was a fearsome, protective passion. The Black Duke, they whispered behind their fans, was in love. Damien returned to the party, his composure perfectly restored. He met Roblin's gaze from across the room, and she felt a dizzying, terrifying wave of emotion. He had defended her. Not her title, not her fortune. Her. He had unleashed the monster of his reputation to protect her honor. The wall she had so carefully constructed around her heart, the one built of logic and fear and a lifetime of disappointment, began to crumble into dust. For the first time, she did not see a storm she had to survive. She saw a shield. And she began, with a sense of dawning horror, to seriously doubt her own resistance. It was the 7th day, the final day. The deadline loomed over Harwood Manor, heavy and silent. Roblin waited in the library, the one room where she felt most herself, the air smelling of old paper and beeswax. Bright, late-afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall, arched windows, illuminating the swirling dust motes in the air, each one a tiny world suspended in the charged silence. Her mind was a battlefield. One moment she saw Damien on the terrace, a figure of terrifying power, his quiet ferocity a shield between her and the world. The next, she remembered his cold-blooded confession, "I made a wager." Which was the real man? The monster who protected her, or the strategist who sought to possess her as a prize? The week was ending, and she was no closer to an answer. She braced herself for his arrival, expecting a final logical summation of his case, a closing argument in the trial for her hand. He arrived precisely on time, but he was not the man she expected. He was not the formidable duke from the musicale or the witty intellectual from their garden debates. He was dressed simply, for travel, and he looked tired. The formidable armor of the Black Duke was gone, leaving only the man, Damien Constantine, looking uncertain in the golden light of her library. He did not approach her immediately, but stood by the window, his gaze lost somewhere in the sprawling green of her estate. "The wager is forfeit," he said, his voice quiet, directed at the glass. "I released my brother from it this morning. There are no terms. There is no game." He turned to face her, and his eyes were stripped of all their usual defenses. The ice, the amusement, the strategic calculation. It was all gone. All that remained was a raw, unnerving vulnerability. "This has nothing to do with my duty or my family," he said, taking a slow step towards her. "And it has nothing to do with yours. It has nothing to do with titles or fortunes or shields or swords." He stopped just before her, so close she could see the exhaustion etched around his eyes. He did not reach for her. He simply stood there, offering nothing but his presence. "Marry me, Roblin," he said, and the words were not a proposal but a plea. "Not as the Duchess to my Duke. Just as you. With me." The simplicity of it shattered her composure. This was not the attack she had prepared for. It was a complete surrender. All her arguments, her defenses, her carefully constructed logic felt like useless sandbags against a rising tide of emotion. She could see in his eyes that this was real. The man before her was not playing a game. He was laying his heart at her feet, and she was terrified of what it meant. She had to know. She had to ask the one question that would reveal everything. "And if I refuse again?" she asked, her voice a fragile whisper. She was testing him one last time. Was this about his pride? Was this still in some small way about winning? Damien did not flinch. He did not look away. A sad, resigned smile touched his lips, a look of profound and ancient loneliness. He held her gaze, and the entire truth of the man, all his pain and all his longing, was laid bare for her to see. "Then I'll remain unmarried," he said, his voice thick with a decade of solitude. "I've waited this long for someone to see me." Damien's confession hung in the sunlit library, a statement of such raw, staggering vulnerability that it left no room for argument or debate. Roblin felt as though the floor had vanished from beneath her feet. The man she had prepared to fight had laid down all his weapons, and she did not know what to do in the face of his surrender. "I need time," she managed to say, the words feeling small and inadequate. "I cannot give you an answer now." A flicker of profound pain crossed his face before it was replaced by a familiar, guarded mask. He had shown her his soul, and she had not accepted it. To him, this was a rejection. He gave a single, stiff nod. "As you wish, Duchess." He turned and walked out of her library, out of her home, and a moment later, the sound of his carriage pulling away was one of deafening finality. In London, Damien Constantine ceased to exist. In his place, the Black Duke returned with a vengeance. He retreated into the cold marble fortress of his home, becoming a ghost to society and a tyrant in his business dealings. He ignored his brother Bram's concerned visits. He was merciless in his negotiations, crushing a rival without a second thought. The world had rejected the man, so he would give them the monster they expected. But every night, the monster bled. Alone in his vast, dark study, with only a single lamp cutting through the shadows and a bottle of brandy for company, he allowed the mask to fall. He was consumed by the belief that he had gambled everything on her and lost. On the 14th night of her silence, he finally broke. He took out a sheet of heavy paper and a pen, and he wrote, "Roblin, they call me the Black Duke. They are not wrong. I have cultivated a reputation for ruthlessness because it is a far better shield than a heart. A heart, I have learned, breaks. A reputation does not. For 10 years, that shield has been enough, until I saw you, standing alone in a room full of people, and realized for the first time how hollow my fortress truly was. I did not ask for your hand to win a wager. I asked for it because I am a drowning man, and you are the first sight of land I have seen in a decade." He wrote until the sun threatened the horizon, pouring a lifetime of loneliness onto the page. He sealed the letter with black wax, his hand trembling slightly. And then he opened a drawer in his desk and locked it away, an admission of defeat he could never bear to send. Meanwhile, at Harwood Manor, Roblin was on her own journey. 2 days after Damien's departure, she had received an unexpected visitor. Ruth, the Dowager Duchess, arrived not with pleas or demands, but with a small, leather-bound chest. "My son is a fool," Ruth had said, her tone crisp but her eyes holding a deep maternal worry. "He believes the only way to protect himself is to show the world his armor, never his heart. It is a lonely way to live." She placed the chest on the table between them. "I will not insult your intelligence by trying to persuade you. But if you are to truly consider this, you should have all the facts. You should know the man, not just the Duke. Inside the chest were Damien's journals. For 2 weeks, Roblin did not leave her estate. She sat in the bright, sun-filled library and read, and the world she thought she knew rearranged itself around her. She saw him not as a duke, but as a boy, full of fierce ideals. She read of his profound love for a friend lost to a pointless war. She felt the searing, youthful heartbreak of his first betrayal. The words on the page still raw with a pain he had never allowed the world to see. He wrote of his return to England, of the suffocating emptiness of his grand house, and the hollow performance of society. She was not reading the words of a monster. She was reading the words of a man who had been so deeply wounded that he had built a fortress around his heart and forgotten how to lower the drawbridge. She reached the final entry, written the night before he first saw her at the ball. 10 years, it read, and I am still a ghost in my own life. Is there anyone left in this world who values honesty over performance? Someone who sees? Roblin looked up from the page, the journal resting in her lap. The bright library was quiet, the air still. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. His final words to her in this very room echoed in her mind. I've waited this long for someone to see me. She had seen him now, all of him, and in the quiet of her heart, a decision, clear and terrifying and absolute, had finally been made. The journey back to London was not one of hesitation, but of quiet, unwavering purpose. Roblin had left Harwood Manor as a woman besieged by doubt. She returned as a woman who knew, with terrifying certainty, what she wanted. His journals, filled with the words he could never say aloud, were now a map of his soul, and she had followed it to its inevitable conclusion. She did not arrive at Constantine House with fanfare. Her simple carriage pulled up to the imposing marble steps without announcement. The butler, the same man who had served Damien with rigid formality for years, opened the door, and his composure visibly cracked at the sight of her. Your Grace, he stammered. Please do not announce me, Roblin said, her voice soft but firm. Where is he? The butler's eyes were filled with a worry that transcended his professional duties. In the library, Your Grace. He has been unwell, she nodded, a silent thanks passing between them. With her heart beating a steady, resolute rhythm against her ribs, she walked through the great hall. The house was a masterpiece of architecture and design, the bright light from the tall windows reflecting off pristine marble and priceless art. But it was utterly devoid of warmth. It was a beautiful, cold and silent tomb, a perfect reflection of the man who had locked himself away inside it. Every step she took echoed in the vast emptiness. She reached the heavy oak doors of the library and pushed one open gently. The hinges gave a low groan. The room was a cave of shadows and sorrow. Heavy curtains were drawn, allowing only a single, defiant sliver of afternoon light to cut through the gloom. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, leather, and stale brandy. And there, in the center of the chaos of scattered books and neglected papers, she saw him. Damien was slumped in a large, winged armchair, his head lolling to the side, fast asleep. He was still dressed from the day before, his cravat loosened, his auburn hair a mess. His handsome face, unguarded in sleep, was etched with a profound exhaustion that seemed to seep from his very bones. An empty glass sat on the table beside him, and on the corner of his grand desk, illuminated by that single shaft of light, was a letter. A thick, crisp envelope, sealed with black wax, with a single word written on it in his sharp, masculine script. Roblin. Her heart clenched. This was the fortress he had built. This was his despair. She had done this to him, and the sight of it did not fill her with power, but with a deep, aching love and a fierce desire to tear down every last stone of his defenses. She moved into the room as quietly as a phantom, her silk dress whispering over the rich carpet. She stopped directly in front of his chair and simply waited, her presence a silent testament in the dim light. After a long moment he stirred. A low groan escaped his lips as he shifted, his body stiff. He blinked, his eyes opened slowly, his gaze unfocused, clouded with sleep and sorrow. Then his eyes found her. He went completely still. His face, already pale, seemed to drain of all remaining color. He stared at her, unblinking. A statue carved from disbelief. He thought he was dreaming. He was so certain she was a phantom conjured from brandy and a broken heart that he didn't dare to breathe. "Roblin?" he whispered, the name a fragile, questioning puff of air. A soft, sad smile touched her lips as she looked down at the man who had hidden his heart from the world, only to have it break in the lonely darkness of this room. She had read his past, seen his pain, and understood the words he could never say. It was time for her to say hers. "You said you'd wait," she said, her voice clear and steady in the silent library. "I think I'm ready to stop making you." The journey back to London was not one of hesitation, but of quiet, unwavering purpose. Roblin had left Harwood Manor as a woman besieged by doubt. She returned as a woman who knew, with terrifying certainty, what she wanted. His journals, filled with the words he could never say aloud, were now a map of his soul, and she had followed it to its inevitable conclusion. She did not arrive at Constantine House with fanfare. Her simple carriage pulled up to the imposing marble steps without announcement. The butler, the same man who had served Damien with rigid formality for years, opened the door, and his composure visibly cracked at the sight of her. "Your Grace," he stammered. "Please do not announce me," Roblin said, her voice soft but firm. "Where is he?" The butler's eyes were filled with a worry that transcended his professional duties. "In the library, Your Grace. He has been unwell." She nodded, a silent thanks passing between them. With her heart beating a steady, resolute rhythm against her ribs, she walked through the great hall. The house was a masterpiece of architecture and design, the bright light from the tall windows reflecting off pristine marble and priceless art. But it was utterly devoid of warmth. It was a beautiful, cold and silent tomb, a perfect reflection of the man who had locked himself away inside it. Every step she took echoed in the vast emptiness. She reached the heavy oak doors of the library and pushed one open gently. The hinges gave a low groan. The room was a cave of shadows and sorrow. Heavy curtains were drawn, allowing only a single, defiant sliver of afternoon light to cut through the gloom. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, leather, and stale brandy. And there, in the center of the chaos of scattered books and neglected papers, she saw him. Damien was slumped in a large, winged armchair, his head lolling to the side, fast asleep. He was still dressed from the day before, his cravat loosened, his auburn hair a mess. His handsome face, unguarded in sleep, was etched with a profound exhaustion that seemed to seep from his very bones. An empty glass sat on the table beside him, and on the corner of his grand desk, illuminated by that single shaft of light, was a letter. A thick, crisp envelope, sealed with black wax, with a single word written on it in his sharp, masculine script. Roblin. Her heart clenched. This was the fortress he had built. This was his despair. She had done this to him, and the sight of it did not fill her with power, but with a deep, aching love and a fierce desire to tear down every last stone of his defenses. She moved into the room as quietly as a phantom, her silk dress whispering over the rich carpet. She stopped directly in front of his chair and simply waited, her presence a silent testament in the dim light. After a long moment, he stirred. A low groan escaped his lips as he shifted, his body stiff. He blinked, his eyes opened slowly, his gaze unfocused, clouded with sleep and sorrow. Then his eyes found her. He went completely still. His face, already pale, seemed to drain of all remaining color. He stared at her, unblinking, a statue carved from disbelief. He thought he was dreaming. He was so certain she was a phantom, conjured from brandy and a broken heart, that he didn't dare to breathe. "Roblin," he whispered, the name a fragile, questioning puff of air. A soft, sad smile touched her lips as she looked down at the man who had hidden his heart from the world, only to have it break in the lonely darkness of this room. She had read his past, seen his pain, and understood the words he could never say. It was time for her to say hers. "You said you'd wait," she said, her voice clear and steady in the silent library. "I think I'm ready to stop making you." Several months after their wedding, an unfamiliar peace had settled over the house of Constantine. The Black Duke's fearsome reputation had softened, and the Duchess was no longer a subject of pity, but of quiet admiration. For the first time, both Roblin and Damien were simply allowed to be themselves, their private world a sanctuary of shared books, witty debates, and a profound, healing love. The peace shattered on a Tuesday. Damien had been summoned to a private meeting with the king's most trusted ministers, a highly unusual command that had set the entire house on edge. Roblin waited in their private drawing room, the bright afternoon light doing little to warm the cold knot of anxiety in her stomach. When Damien finally returned, his face was a mask of grim, energized purpose. The air of contentment he had worn for months was gone, replaced by the sharp, strategic intensity of the man she had first met. "They have made me an offer," he said, his voice low and serious. He began to pace the room, the controlled energy of a caged predator radiating from him. "The king's health is failing. His heir is young and easily swayed. The Privy Council is fractured. They need a strong hand to guide the transition, to ensure stability. They have offered me a seat on the Regency Council." Roblin stared at him, the words taking a moment to land. The Regency Council? It was a position of almost unimaginable power, a role that would place him a single heartbeat from the throne itself. He would be one of the men ruling England. He expected her to be pleased, honored, but all Roblin felt was a surge of ice-cold panic. This was not a position. It was a prison, a grand gilded cage that would trap them both forever. "No," she whispered, the word escaping before she could stop it. Damien stopped pacing. "No?" he asked, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Roblin, do you understand what this means? The influence, the power to shape the future of the country, to protect our family for generations. I understand that it is a cage," she said, her voice rising with the panic she felt clawing at her throat. "We fought so hard to be more than our titles, to have a life that was our own. This isn't a life, Damien. It's a performance. Your time will not be your own. Your loyalties will not be your own. You will not be your own. You will belong to the crown." It was their first argument. The peace of the last few months dissolved into a cloud of hurt and misunderstanding. "This is about protecting us," he countered, his voice sharp with frustration. "It's about having the power to ensure no one, not a petty courtier like Redgrave or the whims of a future king, can ever threaten us again." "Why can't you see that?" "Because I see what it will do to you," she cried, her deepest fear finally spilling out. "I did not fall in love with the Duke of Constantine. I fell in love with the man who recited poetry in my library, the man who wrote of his loneliness in a journal. I'm afraid that man will disappear under the weight of a crown, and only the regent will be left." The accusation struck him like a physical blow. The frustration on his face was replaced by a look of profound hurt. All his life he had been valued for his power, his title, his strategic mind. She was the only one who had seen past it, and now he felt she was throwing it back in his face, accusing him of choosing the very things she had saved him from. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, his hands gripping her upper arms. His touch was not harsh, but desperate, a plea for her to understand. "You think I would do this for the power?" he asked, his voice a low, ragged growl. His piercing blue eyes bored into hers, searching for the faith he so desperately needed to see there. "You think I'd accept a crown and stop being yours?" It was almost a year to the day since the Black Duke had first asked the leftover Duchess to dance, and the world had turned on its axis. They stood once more in the Duke of Alistair's grand ballroom, a glittering, vibrant universe of crystal and light. But tonight, nothing was the same. Damien's furious, heartfelt question all those months ago had shattered Roblin's fears. He had not accepted the regency. He had refused the crown's gilded cage, proving to her and to himself that his loyalty was to their private world, not the public one. Instead, he had accepted a role as the king's most trusted private advisor, a position of immense power wielded from the shadows, a role that always, without fail, allowed him to come home to her. From across the room, Damien watched his wife. She was surrounded by a circle of admirers, her laughter echoing in the bright, music-filled air. She was radiant, dressed in a gown of deep sapphire that made her dark hair shine and her skin glow. He was no longer her shield. She had no need of one. She was a queen in her own right, confident and beloved. The man he was, the man she had seen and chosen, was a thing of her making as much as his own. A few feet away, Dahlia and her friends watched Roblin with the same rapt attention, but the venom of last year was gone, replaced by a bitter, undeniable awe. "Look at her," Dahlia whispered behind her fan, the words sharp with envy. "She tamed the Black Duke." Roblin, overhearing the remark as she passed, smiled to herself. They still didn't understand. They saw a conquest, a taming. They couldn't comprehend the truth of it. She hadn't tamed a beast, she had simply seen a man. Just then, the orchestra struck the opening chords of a waltz. It was the same melody, the same haunting, beautiful music that had played when he had first asked for her hand in the middle of a stunned ballroom. Their eyes met across the crowded floor. A silent, perfect understanding passed between them, a conversation that held the memory of spilled wine, of a scandalous dance, of journals filled with secrets, of a desperate, unsent letter, and of a kiss that had sealed their world into being. Damien began to move towards her, but stopped as he saw the slow, confident smile spread across her face. She began to walk toward him. The sea of brightly coloured dancers parted for her as if by instinct. All eyes were on the Duchess of Constantine as she approached her husband, her expression one of pure, unadulterated love. She stopped before him, an echo of a scene that had become the stuff of legend. But this time, it was her hand she offered. "May I have this dance, Your Grace?" she asked, her voice laced with a playful, happy mischief. The last traces of the Black Duke, of the lonely soldier and the broken-hearted boy, vanished forever in the warmth of his smile. He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers as if they were made for no other purpose. "Only if you call me Damien." He pulled her into his arms, and they swept on to the floor. They were not a scandal now. They were a certainty. The feared Duke and the forgotten Duchess, two lonely souls who had found their home in each other, dancing in the centre of a world that was finally, rightfully theirs.